Hello, my name is Aviva, and today I'm going to be giving you a beginner's guide to Booktubers' favorite fantasy series. Maybe you're new to the Booktube, Bookstagram, BookTok community, and you're not really sure where to start with fantasy, or maybe you're new to the fantasy genre in general, and you just want to have a clear-cut answer of what are the series to start with, what are the series that all of these booktubers are always talking about, always referring to, all of that sort of stuff. So today I'm going to break down for you all of booktubers' favorite fantasy series. And I don't mean that these are people's top tier fantasy series, even though most of these are some people's favorite fantasy series, but these are just the series that every booktuber has read, every booktuber talks about. They love referring to it. They love chatting about what their thoughts are on these, just because these are all of the hyped up books, all of the ones that more or less everyone has read. And to be a part of the talk and to be a part of the community, these are books that you should just know what they're about. So today I'm going to run you through all of them so that first of all, you have a clear-cut answer of what books you should start with reading if you're trying to get yourself into fantasy, or if you just want to be part of the booktube conversation, or you're just looking for some general fantasy recommendations. Also, before we get started, if you're not following me on Instagram, TikTok, Goodreads, you should definitely check out the description down below, because I have all of my social medias linked in that description, so you can go follow me everywhere. And also, if you're not currently subscribed to this channel, you should subscribe, because I have good book content and you're already here, so why not? Just go do it. Either way, I'm going to start off this video with Sarah J Maas. So Sarah J Maas is maybe one of the most talked about authors in the Bookstagram, Booktube, everywhere community. We have 3 series by her. We have Throne of Glass, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and Crescent City, which the first book is A House of Earth and Blood. I don't really know anything about this series, mostly because I haven't read it yet, because this is the first book in the series and the second book is not out yet. The second book is coming out in February, and I happen to binge series. So because I have not read this series yet, we're not going to talk about it, but I did want to mention that, she's got 3 series out there, and this is her newest release, and also one of these series that is not completed by her. But for the most part, we have Throne of Glass and A Court of Thorns and Roses. So Throne of Glass is an 8-book series, and in this series you start off by following an assassin named Selena, and she's going to be invited to the king's palace to try and become his champion, and if she wins, she's going to be his personal assassin. So in the first book, you're kind of following that, but the reason why people love this above all else is because not only does it have an amazing magic system, an awesome world building, and aesthetic and feeling going on, as well as politics and wars and all of those good stuff that you want when you're reading a fantasy series, but there's also some amazing romances that are my favorites of all time. What Sarah J Maas is very well known for is her amazing romances in her fantasy series. That is what you find in both of these series, but in Throne of Glass, it's just a great series. It's a completed series, so you can pick this up knowing that you are going to get an awesome ending. And if you like romances and you like fantasy and you want to try a romance fantasy, then you should definitely check out Throne of Glass. But then we also have A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is a little higher on the romance level. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it is kind of confusing as to if this series is completed or not. It actually started out as a 3-book series, but then she decided to continue on. So she made a little novella, and then she added on one more book after the series was technically completed, and you're kind of following side characters from the original 3 books as they have their own story going on with a continuation of what actually happened in this series. So I know it sounds pretty confusing. It's not that confusing, but all I'm going to say is that this series technically isn't completed. There's technically 2 more books coming out in this series, and the last 2 books are going to be following other side characters from the original 3 books. So with that said, this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but it also has an interesting magic system, an interesting world building, as well as a war thing going on. So it's got all of that high fantasy things that you're looking for, but also it's got maybe one of the best romances out there, in a romance fantasy sort of book. So if you're into that and you like the sound of fantasy romances, then I 100% recommend checking this series out because it is absolutely amazing. I love it so much, and the couples in this series are just some of my like die-hard favorites. So with that said, I feel like, you know, people are very confused with Sarah J Maas because you hear so many mixed opinions. Like, is Sarah J Maas good? Like, yeah, she's the best in the world. Or Sarah J Maas is trash and so are her books. The thing is I feel like when a series is so high up there and so beloved by so many, people like trashing on it. People like dissecting it, seeing what's up with it and seeing what they could complain about. So what I would say is if you have never read a Sarah J Maas book before, then you can't decide for yourself until you do. So I recommend picking up either A Court of Thorns and Roses or Throne of Glass to begin with, seeing what she's all about, seeing if her style meshes well with you, and then making a decision for yourself. So next up we have From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So this is currently a collection of 3 books, but this series is not completed. It is still ongoing. The author is writing a couple of more books in this series, as well as a prequel that is coming out sometime in October. We are going to be following like a whole nother story of something that was mentioned in this first book. But either way, this series is amazing. If you are a fan of A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas, you will be a huge fan of this. The series both feel very similar to each other, specifically in like the romance department. I felt like it was laid out very similarly and it kind of played out in a very like familiar way, but in a good way. Like if you are a fan of ACOTAR, you will be a fan of this and you will enjoy it very much. So this is another high fantasy series. You've got like magical beings, magic in this world. There's a lot of stuff to discover, and in the first book, you are going to have a lot of questions, mostly because the main character has a lot of questions. She's kind of a chosen one, but she doesn't want to be the chosen one. She doesn't really like her position in the world, and therefore she is very rebellious, and you kind of get to see her as she is like fighting back with all of these people who are trying to like keep her under wraps. And while she is fighting back, she's going to learn a lot about like the people that surround her and the world that she's living in and all of the secrets that people are basically keeping from her. So it's a very interesting series to try to explain because I don't really want to give away any spoilers. So all I'm going to say is that if you are a fan of fantasies and romances mixed together, then you should definitely check this series out. And especially if you have read ACOTAR and you are a fan of that, then this should be the next series that you pick up. Next up, The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is a collection of 3 books. It is a trilogy. It is a YA fantasy story about Fae. So I feel like people hype this book up a lot, and when you hear about people talk about this book, you kind of hear like Carden and Jude, I love that romance, it's so amazing, oh my god, oh my god. And the thing is that's what I heard before I picked up this series, and it got me so excited because I was a huge fan of romances in my fantasies, and I'm like, oh my god, this is a new one. I love Fae, I love romances, I love politics and like that sort of world, and you know what, this sounds like it's got everything I'm looking for. And then unfortunately, I was extremely disappointed. But I'm not saying that this series is bad. All I'm saying is that if you pick this series up thinking that it is a romance fantasy and like you're picking it up for the romance, then you are most probably going to be extremely disappointed. So I will say that if you wanted to read this series, you definitely should. I think it is a very solid series overall, but it's kind of more of a political fantasy story than a romance story. It's kind of like a series where you're just following this girl and she kind of gets herself involved with a lot of like the Fae politics. She's a human and she never really felt like she fit in very well, so she kind of like pushes herself into the world and tries to like, you know, get in with like the high society of these Fae sort of people so that she feels like she belongs. And while she's there, she does end up having a romance with this prince named Carden, and it's a pretty solid romance, but it is so minuscule in the sense of like what a normal romance fantasy is that if you're picking this up for the romance, you will most probably be disappointed. So I just wanted to like get that out there that this is a solid series, and I'm not necessarily bashing on everybody who says that this is the best series series in the world, and I love Juden and Carden. Like, good for you that you like it. All I'm saying is that if you haven't read this series before and you see it all over the place and you want to read it, go into it with low expectations in the romance department and read it for its world building and its politics. That's really all I gotta say. This is an extremely popular series that people love to talk about, and it is definitely a series that you should be familiar with if you wanted to know what the popular fantasy series are in the booktube community. Next up, we have Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson world. So Percy Jackson has a large universe. There are multiple series following Percy Jackson and his gang. Rick Riordan has written a lot of series. We have got the first series, which is his middle grade series. It's a collection of 5 books, and it is the start of Percy Jackson's story when he is 12 years old and he finds out that he is actually half god. He is the son of Poseidon, which is a Greek god, and he is going to go to Camp Half-Blood, and things are going to happen. So you're following a lot of Greek mythology, and don't let that overwhelm you. Rick Riordan has a really amazing way of pulling you into the world, making you understand Greek mythology as if you've always known it before and as if it's part of our actual universe. So I really enjoy this series. I'm currently up to book 3 and I really couldn't recommend it more. I'm having such an amazing time reading this series, and I am just so excited about the fact that after I finish this series, there is a series after this and it turns from middle grade into YA. So I am really excited to just keep following Percy Jackson's story, and I just know that after I even read the next series in this universe, there are even more series to follow. There's like the Trials of Apollo and Magnus Chase. Basically, Rick Riordan writes a lot of books. He is a great writer. He writes a really fun adventure fantasy story where you're following all this Greek mythology sort of stuff, and overall he's great. People love to talk about him. People love to rave about him, mostly because he's just great. So another series on Booktubers' favorite list is definitely Percy Jackson and all of Rick Riordan's work. Next up, we have Shadow and Bone, which is the Grishaverse, basically. Leigh Bardugo has invented this entire universe where all of her series take place. And there's basically 3 series. You've got Shadow and Bone, which is a collection of 3 books. Then you have Six of Crows, which is a duology. And then you have King of Scarves, which is another duology. There's lots of ways you can read this series. People will tell you a lot of different information. I'm a fan of reading things chronologically, so I am going to start out with Shadow and Bone, which not only is the first book to read in this universe because of chronological reasons, but also it is the first book that came out in this universe. So why not start with it? Some people will say because Six of Crows is better and get a better feel for what the world is about before you get into it. But I started with Shadow and Bone. I was fine with it, and therefore I am going to talk about it first. So Shadow and Bone, you basically get to learn the very interesting magic system that is a part of this world. And there's a lot of politics going on and things that people are trying to defeat, and it's basically a very interesting high fantasy sort of world. And you're gonna follow this girl that thought that she was always this normal little person in this universe. She was nothing special. She was just a soldier in one of the armies in this universe, and she finds out that she is actually this great magical being that people have been looking for a really long time. So that is the start of the story. Obviously, she's going to be taken to the king's palace to learn about her magic, and she's going to meet people and get into politics, and a lot of things are going to happen, and she's going to basically go on a magical adventure. So this is a collection of 3 books. In my opinion, this series is meh. I ended up giving the entire thing 3 stars, but I am happy that I read it so that I kind of know what everybody is talking about when they talk about this series. I know that a lot of people absolutely adore this series. I wasn't the hugest fan. I thought that the entire idea of it was actually very cool. I really enjoyed the magic system, but there was a lot of it that I thought was nothing special. I kind of wished that certain things ended up playing out differently, and honestly, I found most of it forgettable. So that is Shadow and Bone. Then we have a Six of Crows, which is a duology. It takes place after the events that happen in Shadow and Bone. My reasoning for that is because you are going to see some characters that were side characters in Shadow and Bone show up in Six of Crows, and the way that they show up, you definitely know that they are showing up after the events that happened in Shadow and Bone, but it's really such a minimal overlap that you technically could read this series first if it sounds more intriguing to you, but technically it happens afterwards. Either way, this is a heist book. You are following a lot of characters that live in a place called Ketterdam. I'm pretty sure I said this, but Ketterdam is another place in the Shadow and Bone universe, and you are kind of going to follow them as they go on this heist that nobody else really wants to go on, because it's kind of like, you know, a mission that nobody is going to be able to do besides for the people that decide to take it up, obviously. So anyway, you're following multiple characters in this series. A lot of them are really good. A lot of them I didn't really care for, but either way, it is a great group of characters. You're going to find somebody that you love. Maybe you're going to like all of them. Maybe you're just going to like some of them like me, but either way, it's a heist book. And while that's going on, you also get to see a little bit more of the magic system that was originally introduced in Shadow and Bone. And overall, this is just a really fun series. If you are a fan of heists, this one will be a really fun time. And lastly, we have King of Scars, which is the third series in this universe. It is a duology, though. It is King of Scars and then Rule of Wolves. And you have to read this after you read both Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows, mostly because in this series, you are following side characters from both of those series after the events that happen at the end of Six of Crows. If you pick this up without reading Six of Crows, and especially without reading Shadow and Bone, you're not really going to understand what's going on. So I definitely recommend reading this series. It was actually my favorite series from the universe. I was a huge fan of this, and it was funny that I was, because originally when I read all the characters that are side characters in the other books but now main characters in this book, I wasn't the hugest fan of some of them in their original stories, but then once I read them as main characters, I was a really big fan of them. So I can't really tell you what this series is about, only because, you know, spoilers for the other series, but all I'm going to say is that I loved this series, and if you go ahead and read Six of Crows and Shadow and Bone, then you should definitely pick this series up after. So depending on the crowd of booktubers that you watch, you might come across a lot of people who are huge fans of Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson and Brandon Sanderson in general. This is an adult high fantasy series where you're basically following like an overthrowing of an empire. There is this guy that has been, you know, ruling this like entire world for like 1,000 years, and you're basically jumping into the story when someone decides to take him down, and you're gonna follow a lot of characters. You are going to see some of the most interesting and unique magic systems you have ever encountered in any fantasy series you might ever read. And in general, this is just a really fun adult high fantasy series. I feel like it is a really good introduction to adult high fantasy as well. So if you are not a big fan or you've never really read adult high fantasy like before, then I wouldn't let this series like, you know, deter you from picking it up, mostly because I think that you are introduced to the world, the magic system, and like everything about this in a very like easy to understand way. So I feel like it is a really good introduction to adult high fantasy, and also this is a series that a lot of people love to rave about, and I definitely understand why. I really enjoyed this series. There's 3 books that are all this thick, so it is pretty big, but Brandon Sanderson is known to write a lot. All of his books are massive. This is actually some of his shorter books. If you know, you want to believe me, I'm telling you, just look up like The Way of Kings or whatever that series is. Like, wow, those books are really massive. So this is a really good introduction to Brandon Sanderson in general, mostly because this is one of his most popular series, and also a really good way of getting a feel for what he's about and if he's going to be up your alley. But also, it's a great introduction to adult high fantasy. And also, booktubers love to chat about this series. So if you wanted to try it, I 100% recommend it, only because, you know, it's awesome. It's really well laid out. It's a really fun time. The characters are really great, and the magic system is, wow, one of a kind, amazing. So next I wanted to talk about An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir. So this is a collection of 4 books, and this is very popular on BookTube. Honestly, I don't see it as much on like Bookstagram, but I see it enough to know that this is a very popular series in the book world community of online social media sort of thing. So in this series, you're kind of following like these 2 characters. One is a soldier for like the Empire, and one is a slave for the Empire. You're living in this like world where there's like a big caste system. Like there are slaves and then there are soldiers, and people are either born into one or the other, and there's no real way of like getting yourself out of it. And obviously throughout all 4 of these books, you are going to see a lot of politics, a lot of wars, a lot of things like that. But the first series starts out where you're just following these 2 characters, and they obviously come from like opposite ends of the world, and their stories are going to somehow intertwine, and then you are going to continue to follow both of them as they go on a journey together to basically like overthrow the world that they're living in. So throughout this series, you're also going to see like some magic in here. Like there's a very interesting magic system that you're slowly going to be, like introduced to, and there's basically a lot of stuff that goes on in the series. Unfortunately though, I wasn't the hugest fan of this series. I die-hard loved book 1. I was the hugest fan of book 1, but as we got later and later into the series unfortunately went downhill for me. I just didn't like the twists and the turns that this series took. It was a very personal thing to me. I think that this series is amazing, and I definitely understand why people like it. It just wasn't a series for me. So I would recommend trying it out, seeing it for yourself, because obviously everybody has their own personal taste, and even though this series wasn't my favorite, it could very well be another favorite for you. So I wanted to add it into this list, not only because it's a series that I feel like should be recommended because a lot of people will very much enjoy it, but also this is a series that is very often talked about on BookTube, and here we are doing a beginner's guide for BookTube. So this is another series that you should familiarize yourself with. Next, I wanted to talk about The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson and its spin-off duology, which is A Dance of Thieves. So in A Kiss of Deception, it's a collection of 3 books. You're basically following this princess who at the beginning decides that she doesn't want to marry the prince that she was set up to marry. So on the day of her wedding, she basically runs away and decides to just live a normal life because she didn't want to marry a prince she has never met. And basically the prince gets very insulted and is like, who is this girl that, stood me up at the altar sort of thing? So he basically is going to chase after her and try to find out who the hell this girl is. And at the same time, you're also going to see another character that is from another kingdom that is basically after this girl to assassinate her. And they're basically going to have a little bit of like a love triangle sort of thing throughout this series. It's a really good time. If you're a fan of love triangles, you should definitely check this series out. I really loved the romance that was going on in this series. I was a huge fan of it. I really liked the love triangle of it. I never knew at the beginning like which way it was going to go, but then obviously once it got there, I'm like, oh my god, it was totally meant to be that way. So I really loved this series. I definitely recommend it, especially if you're not so into like magic systems, but you just want to read like a different sort of like fantasy, like other place sort of world, because this series doesn't have any actual like magic in it. It's just kind of one of those worlds where like, there's princes and princesses and politics and people living on like horses sort of thing. So I really like this. And then if you're a fan of this series, there is a duology, which is A Dance of Thieves, and you're basically following a couple of characters that were like originally introduced in this series. They were like children in this series, and you're basically following them like it's 9 years later, and they're gonna, have a story of their own, and like, the kid is now grown up and she's going to have a romance for herself. So I actually thought that Dance of Thieves was like more of a romance than The Kiss of Deception was. I was a huge fan of both of these though. I definitely recommend reading The Kiss of Deception, and if you liked it, then checking out Dance of Thieves, because I was a huge fan. I really enjoyed them, and especially if you like romances in your fantasies, this is definitely one to look out for. So next up, I have The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stevewater. This is a collection of 4 books, and they're basically amazing. In this series, you're following like a group of kids who basically are going to go on this adventure / mission to find this dead king, because if you find this dead king, he's going to grant you any wish. So this is kind of like an urban fantasy. You're in this like real world, but there's like magical things going on. There's a lot of like ley lines being talked about and like weird magic that like it feels very like natural, like you can see how it fits into our real world, but there's definitely like a lot of magic that like would never actually happen in our universe, but it feels very real. You're basically following this girl. Her name is Baloo, and she's kind of like a child from like this psychic family, and she was told that like if she ever kisses the love of her life, she's gonna kill him. So she kind of ends up meeting like this group of kids, and she's gonna like befriend them, and she's gonna go on this adventure with them that like, you know, is to find this dead king, and it's gonna be a really fun time. It's kind of like that found family, like finding my best friends sort of thing. And at the same time, there's like a trickle of a romance because, you know, this girl knows that if she falls in love with one of them, she can never kiss them because she might kill them. So you've got that like underlying thing going on. But honestly, this is more of like an adventure story of following a bunch of kids who end up becoming best friends, and you're just gonna fall in love with them and their friend group, and you're just gonna want to go on the adventure with them. So this is a really fun series. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was such a fun time. It was a great YA series just to, you know, like put a smile on your face, and I definitely recommend it. It is definitely a series that was talked about often on BookTube way back when, and is still sometimes referred to in passing. So if you wanted to know what people were talking about, this is what they're talking about. I 100% recommend reading it, and I also think it is a great series to start off with if you are just getting yourself into fantasy, because it's a great time. It's very easy to comprehend, and I don't think it'll disappoint you. Next, I wanted to talk about A Darker Shades of Magic by V.E. Schwab. So this is a collection of 3 books, and this is an adult high fantasy series. You're basically in this universe that has 4 parallel Londons. There's Grey London, that is our London. There's no magic there. Then there's Red London, which is thriving in magic. It is a very magical, like high fantasy sort of world. Then you've got like, I believe it's White London, that it has magic there too, but like it's very bad magic. It's like very negative there. People are very bad, and like the magic there is just really bad. And then you've got Black London, which used to be a magical London, but something happened there a long time ago and nobody lives there anymore. And in this series, you're following this guy who is from Red London, and he has the abilities to jump between London. So he's kind of like the ambassador for the king and queen there, and he kind of like sends messages between his London and Grey London and White London. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this series. There are magical competitions. You're gonna meet a lot of characters. There are some good characters, there are some bad characters, there are some magical characters, there are some non-magical characters. It's basically a really fun time, and it is an adult high fantasy series, so it is just like a little bit next level. I don't really know how to explain in what sense, but I think it's very easy to comprehend. I think it's a really good time, and I think it's another series that if you are used to YA fantasy, or you're just used to like YA in general, then you could still pick this series up because it's a good introduction to adult fantasy. And lastly, I'm going to talk about Shadow and Bone by Cassandra Clare. So this is the Shadowhunter universe. This is a very overwhelming series for people to get into if they are not familiar with the Shadowhunter world. Basically, there is, I believe, 5 series that all take place in the Shadowhunter world over the span of like 200 years. It sounds very confusing. There are a lot of books to navigate between. I am holding up the first book that was ever published from this world, which is City of Bones. It's the first book in the Mortal Instruments series, and honestly, I am not going to sit here for 10 minutes trying to explain to you the entire Shadowhunter world. So I'm just going to link a video down in the description below where I basically talk about how to read the Shadowhunter universe, what all of these series are about, and in what order I recommend reading them. So I'm not going to talk about any of that. All I'm going to say is that Shadowhunters in general are basically demon hunting warriors that live among us. Humans don't really know that demons exist. They don't really know that Shadowhunters exist, but Shadowhunters are basically the policemen for the universe, and they protect humankind from demons. So there's a lot of magic going on in this world. It is an urban fantasy, so it is very well mixed into our universe. It feels very real. It feels as if, you know, this thing is happening right in front of you and you're human, so you just can't see this. So it's very easy to comprehend. It's a great series to like start off with if you are getting yourself into fantasy in general. But there is a lot of books to read in this universe, which is a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing because if you like one of this series, then you have so much more to read. But it's a bad thing because it really deters a lot of people from picking it up because they're not really sure where to start. And that's kind of why I made a whole video about like where to start, how I recommend reading it, and all that sort of stuff. So I definitely recommend checking that entire video out if you wanted to like learn more about this entire universe. But basically, this is another series that is extremely popular on BookTube, Bookstagram, BookTok, all of the places. It is one of the most amazing fantasy series and worlds that you can be introduced to if you are trying to get into fantasy in general, as well as if you are just trying to understand what people are talking about in their BookTube videos when they mention Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunter universe. So this is the last series that I wanted to talk about for this video. I think I gave you guys a really good rundown of BookTubers' favorite fantasy series, but I'm curious to know what you thought of this video. Did you enjoy it? Did you like seeing the recommendations? Did you like the way that I broke it down? Let me know. I'd love to make other beginner's guides for you. So if you had any like video recommendations for me, like something that you wanted to see from me, let me know down in the comment section below. But either way, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not currently subscribed to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. And like always, thank you so much for watching this video. And until next time, enjoy reading.